A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment is a nonprofit organization supported entirely by your donations. If you've ever enjoyed one of our podcast episodes or classes, please consider supporting us with a contribution of any size right now on our website at skepticspath.org. I'm Scott Snibbe, and this is A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment, where we share practical ideas from Buddhism to build happier lives, stronger relationships, and a better world. Last month, I sat down with the MacArthur Award-winning restorative justice advocate Sujatha Baliga for a book release event at the Kyoto Foundation in California. It was a special moment for us because we've both taught meditation at this Tibetan Buddhist center for many years. It's the place where I tested many of the meditations that appear in my new book, How to Train a Happy Mind. If you want to know more about Sujatha, listen to the wonderful interview she shared with our podcast on healing trauma. And if you're looking for a copy of How to Train a Happy Mind, you can find it in print, ebook, and audiobook anywhere you buy books.
Welcome. He's got book. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. There was some traffic out there, and but it's a blessing to have all of you be here with us tonight. I'm so thrilled to be asked to be part of this event for the launch of Scott's brand new book, How to Train a Happy Mind, which is available in the back corner over there. So thank you, Scott, for welcoming us all here. And should we just launch right in, or are there any?
Yeah, sure. I'm really grateful Sujatha agreed to do this. Yesterday she showed me her flow chart for agreeing to do things, which has about 18 steps. So we made it through to the end. So thank you.
I didn't actually consult that. So there's a different flow chart that I use, which is simply the question of, does my heart explode with life? But yes, I will admit that I have a very, very convoluted, complicated decision-making tree that Scott just got to bypass, because this is really awesome. So, thanks. Scott, I want to just jump right in with How to Train a Happy Mind. Comes from your years and years of meditation experience and your work on Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. What inspired you to write a book about it, right? Because you're already putting things out into the world, teaching here and elsewhere.
Well, I got invited to in our tradition, you have to be invited to teach meditation, which is a good safeguard. It doesn't always work, but it's a pretty good one. Oh, we managed to pass through it somehow, or at least me pass through it somehow. But the reason it's a book is that I've been asked by my friends, some of whom are here. For many people, I'm the only Buddhist they know. For many of my friends, I'm the only religious person they know. In fact, I've married some of my friends, not a three-way marriage, but I was the officiant. So people would come to me and say, how do I get started with Buddhism? And out of all the hundreds of books I've read, I could not recommend one that was a good start. Buddhism is very complicated and really worthwhile, but I could never come up with a book to start with. So you're an inspiration, because Sujatha has a beautiful quote that says, you don't have to be perfect to do good. Sujatha is my inspiration in many, many dimensions. And some teachers write a book just by sitting on a throne and speaking, and they transcribe it and publish the book. This is more the process. I know how to eventually make something good and maybe even great. You gave me feedback on the book. About 25 other people did, including the Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the end. So I tried to apply that same process. That's not the genius of a Buddhist master, just transcribed, but very hard work and a lot of collaboration and feedback and critical analysis.
So maybe not a Buddhist master, but definitely a long time and very committed student, right? So I want to agree, actually, that it's really hard to find a book to recommend. The difficulty is that folks often try to make it simple, and in so doing, really remove the most important parts of it, right? So there are like secularized versions of Buddhism out there, but I feel like often lose the most important stuff, right? And then those who don't tend to hew so closely to, it's a disciplic succession from going back to the Buddha, and every single thing is passed down so perfectly. But that is not accessible to most people, including folks of Asian heritage who might have even grown up with this, but have parted ways, right? And so I'm really pleased to see this book out here. It's definitely one that I would recommend to folks who are looking for a way in, and especially those who are skeptical. Like you have done what is often asked in the Buddha Dharma, which is to test the gold, is what they say, which is like really check to see that the thing is the thing and then adopt what you find worthy of adoption. And you opted into this tradition, and yet you chose to secularize. So it makes me think of that be who you needed when you were younger kind of thing. But so tell me more about this choice to secularize.
And because there's other teachers too, and I won't get in the weeds about that, like Stephen Batchelor and Robert Wright, who take much more aggressive stances like, no, the Buddha didn't really mean those things. That's not my perspective. It's more like, if you don't believe these things, here is still a way to practice. I'm not making a position about whether they are or aren't true in an absolute sense, but I know my friends and I know the people that come to classes, and they need a path that meets them where they are. That's the purpose, is to let people practice like 1,000-year-old tradition. In many ways, it's a 16 or 1,800-year-old tradition. But to be able to practice that as authentically as possible within our current belief system of the modern world. That's it. And the funny thing is, it's the earlier topics in this sequence that needed the most work. The most advanced topics need almost no work, like the topics of the interdependent nature of reality, compassion, love. But it's the earlier topics that are actually have very strong divisions of like ideas about right and wrong and so on. And that kind of makes me think that those are the parts that were more culturally dependent. You know, I'm not for sure about that. We need, you know, more realized people than me to try to say that for sure. But it felt like the earlier parts needed the more adaptation to our culture.
Interesting. I mean, that kind of leads into my next question about what did you learn while working to secularize? You speak early on about the heavy burden of being this guy outside the culture, being like, here's what we're going to keep and here's what we're not going to keep. What did you learn in that process?
Well, I think a big part of it is just accepting who I am. Like, I would never say I'm a teacher. I like to say I'm a teaching assistant. You know, it's like the person who's like one semester ahead trying to help us. So it's like I'm an equal. And that's why I asked my teachers, when I got invited to teach, I asked my teachers, I said, really, you know, should I be doing this? And they said, no, it's good for people to learn from someone like them, from an equal, right? And so that's the perspective. I'll tell you one thing I learned is that this tradition is quite authoritative, not authoritarian. Like, this is an action that will lead to happiness. This is an action that will lead to suffering. I found that that's not an effective way to come from my mouth and my pen. But that's the way we learned. Like, you and I learned that in a very authoritative, let's even say patriarchal, to use that word. It is a very kind of male-focused lineage, but the most wonderful, compassionate patriarchs you could possibly find. I know I bow down to these patriarchs. But yeah, we both do. But I'm not one of them, right? So what I found when I was writing the book is that whenever the voice sounded like the teachings I got, when it sounded like moralistic, authoritative, what I did is just erase that whole part and told either a story or a joke. and I found that was a really an effective way to teach that, and also keeps people reading, you know, because people love stories.
Another thing I'm noticing throughout the book is and you also invite people to try it out.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of saying this is the way it is, there's a check and see for yourself how this lands as you make an effort at this practice. So there's some nitty-gritty stuff that I want to talk to you about in the book itself. Those of us who are entirely secular, don't believe in like the spiritual aspects of things, have a lot of trouble understanding the mind as being something other than brain function, right? Yeah. And so I think you do a great job of digging into that. It's very complicated stuff. And so one of the things I really love is your hardware-software analogy.
Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure,
that would
sure.
Really
The chapter before I even start the sequence is about the mind. And that's how they teach it in Buddhism too, because if you're training a mind to be happy, you need to know what a mind is. And so Buddhism has a very clear definition of the mind, which is that it's immaterial moments of consciousness that the prior causes the last. You really do need to have some sense that the mind is immaterial in general to gain some insights into how to change the mind. So when people come to me and want to have that debate about whether the mind's material, I say, you already believe in some immaterial things. They say, really? I said, yeah, what about mathematics? You know, where is math? Do you have a math detector? Like, show me, like, do you believe in math? Yes, everyone says yes. Okay, where is it? Is it in the math textbook? Is it in the universe? Is it underlying the universe? Is it in the computer program, and so on? So people believe in math, it's immaterial. Then I would say, what about love? You know, have you ever been in love? Is there a love detector? Can we point it at you and know whether you're in love or not? No, love is immaterial also, we believe in it. Then I like to use this analogy of software, though, because I'm a computer scientist trained, and I just fell in love with computer programming when I was 10 years old, because it was the closest thing to mind that I ever found. It's changing, it's immaterial. And so this is the analogy that I think lands the best with people, because if you look at your computer, it runs software. The computer has hardware, chips and so on, and then there's software running on it. Now, would you ever say that your computer is Microsoft Word, right? Microsoft Word runs on the computer, or Instagram runs on your phone. But no one would ever say, you know, that Instagram is the hardware of the computer, or Microsoft Word is the hardware of the computer. Software is just a changing pattern of information. Like, it's immaterial, and it's even beyond energy. It's not the electron. No one would say the software is the electrons. It's a pattern of information. Like, it's immaterial, and it's not that big of a deal. It's not a woo-woo idea. It doesn't mean that it has a soul, or that it's totally separate from matter. It's interdependent with matter, but it's something different. So it's just to get to that point that it's not that big of a deal. We believe in immaterial things. They're real. They're not like a little light that floats out of you when you die or anything like that. It's just, there are immaterial things, and we rely on them. In fact, they're the best things in life. You know, love and a nice conversation. Conversation's not material, right?
So I just want to name the part of the conversation that just happened is exactly why this book is so yummy, right? Like, this is what I am so loving about this book, and why I think it's something that is going to be really useful for folks to pause and think, like, oh, software, hardware could be brain and mind, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we hold those things? So that's so beautiful. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about analytical meditation, which we love.
Yeah.
So most of the time out there in the world, you know, people hear the word meditation, they think it means sitting perfectly still, and like stopping your thoughts or observing your breath, maybe even. Some people know about that. Some people think about body scanning. So in the lineage we practice in, right, all of that stuff might be useful as a precursor for this whole other thing we do, which is analytical meditation. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So that is one of the other big reasons I wrote this book, is that there is almost maybe no mainstream book, and that's what my publisher claimed, you know, I may be slightly exaggerated, but the first mainstream book on analytical meditation is what they say. There's two types of meditation that they describe in Tibetan Buddhism. One is stabilizing meditation, and that's the meditation where you focus your mind on something. And most people, that's the only type of meditation you've heard of, and that object you focus on is usually your breath. And the purpose of that meditation is to develop your concentration and make you less reactive, you know, so that as things come into your mind, you don't have to be, you know, pulled by them. So it's quite beneficial. And it has a lot of therapeutic uses today, like to reduce anxiety, stress, sleep better, concentrate better, so on. But the second type of meditation, analytical meditation, is almost the opposite of that. That's a type of meditation where you deliberately cultivate thoughts, feelings, emotions, stories. It's kind of like a podcast you play for yourself in your mind. And in so many ways, this is a much more appropriate and effective meditation certainly for Westerners with our kind of active minds. But it's quite easy to focus on a story, sometimes for 2 hours if you go see, 2.5 if you go see Dune or something like that. So that's the beauty of it. It's stories that transform your mind.
So, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about in my experience, right, the breath observation, et cetera, is definitely, and the more you do it, and the longer periods that you do it for, you go on longer retreats and you do these sorts of things, you become habituated to it such that when difficult situations arise, you go, oh, like almost automatically I go to the breath, right? But the true rewiring to create that happy mind really is something that from my side only came through analytical meditation. So could you talk a little bit about that?
That's really important. So a simple way to say that is stabilizing meditation focuses your mind. Analytical meditation changes your mind. It steers your mind. And this is the thing that's, I think, really, really missing from a lot of the popularization of meditation, which is absolutely beneficial, like 100%. But the thing is, there is an ethical dimension to meditation. And that is really what the mindfulness misses a lot of the time. A CEO of a company who's doing something harmful, who meditates every morning, and it helps them focus and do a job that we don't agree is beneficial for the world. Right? So ethics is the foundation of meditation practice. They say ethics comes before concentration. If you don't live an ethical life, you can't concentrate. And I've noticed that. I think you've all noticed it. If you have even a little fight, or you say something rude to somebody, it's hard to focus. You're distracted. You can't sleep at night, right? So it's and this word ethics makes people uncomfortable because they start to think of, various people they've seen on television and so on. Or morality. Morality, yeah. But it's a bit more straightforward in Tibetan Buddhism. It's just certain actions and thoughts lead to happiness, and certain actions and thoughts lead to suffering. And that's been validated through particularly wise practitioners over the course of a couple thousand years.
Yeah. Yeah, and also like the Mind and Life Institute folks now
Yeah.
are actually getting to put the fMRIs on there
Yeah.
and getting to see what parts of your brain light up when you are practicing certain ethical states of mind. Pretty exciting. So a little bit more about analytical meditation, Scott. You write something to the effect of the breakthrough from logical to experiential is the essence of analytical meditation. And so, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
A good example is the difference between reading about love and falling in love. Remember when you were younger? Well, some people are younger, like my daughter here. I think she loves her parents. But I know she loves her parents. But when you think about romantic love, right? Like before you ever fell in love, you read about it. And you think about it, you write about it, you fantasize about it. But the actual experience of being in love is quite different. It doesn't match that, although those things did prepare you for it in ways. That's the idea with analytical meditation, and those things can happen. Sometimes it happens the very first time someone meditates and has a very powerful experience. Other times, I know, like you and I have worked for sometimes years or decades to get over a certain pain or anger or resentment, frustration, and then one day, like, I love my dad. After 47 years, right? Yes. We've both been through that in different ways. Sujatha in much more difficult ways.
So that's a really beautiful description, that the experiential experience that comes from that analytical meditation. And I think that's a huge part of the gift that this book gives. I hope I'm not sounding too much like a commercial, but the truth is that it's rare to see something that explains so beautifully and then gives opportunity for practice within the same book. And so after each chunk, there's a little bit of so I'd love to know a little bit about your choices around that. Like, how is the writing process? I'm going to pause here and put in something that's going to guide folks experientially.
Despite this tradition being so intellectual, we're taught that there's this order of effectiveness of teaching. So they say listening to teachings is good, but that's kind of the weakest form of learning. Then thinking about them after is stronger. That deepens your experience. Then meditating is 1,000 times more effective than any of those. And they say you can be even someone at like the highest level of learning in a monastery, and with that intellectual learning, if you don't meditate, you have very little benefit. And so I wanted to be true to that. So I tried to just distill them quite short. In the audiobook, I guide them so you can, it's a little harder to sit and read and guide yourself in meditation. Right. So in the audiobook, I guide the meditations. But it's essential. You can't gain a realization without meditation, according to our tradition.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of the audiobook, I'm going to ask you, actually, so you can get to hear Scott's beautiful voice, to read a tiny section here. Okay. If you didn't mind, Scott, one of my favorite parts of this book is called Everyone Walks the Hero's Journey. It's just a little bit.
Oh, just that?
Yeah,
okay.
Would you mind reading a little bit for us so we can hear this beautiful section? I have a question about it.
Okay, sure. Everyone walks the hero's journey. From Jesus Christ to Luke Skywalker, the hero's journey is a universal structure for mythical tales of growth and adventure. But each of us is also the hero of our own life. We may rarely acknowledge it, but each of us was born, and every one of us will die. In between, we all experience our own struggles, conflicts, triumphs, and loves. As you encounter people in your daily life, a powerful meditation on impermanence is to picture the moment each of them was born. Imagine their mother's pain, her exhaustion and joy at creating a fragile new being whose life depends on her. Then, try to imagine how that person will eventually die, alone or surrounded by loved ones, agitated or at peace. This technique is especially helpful when you're angry with someone because it helps you put your dispute into perspective. Picture the end of that person's life, in a hospital bed or at home, after a life that was long or short, a life of virtue or misbehavior, a life ending among friends or silently alone. Then try to imagine where that person is right now on their journey from cradle to grave. What dreams, goals, and disappointments they may have had, moments of loneliness and intimacy. Without this kind of reflection, the people around you can seem like video game characters, mere obstacles or aids to your life's agenda. Such a rigid, self-centered view of the people around you is disconnecting and inaccurate. They're all constantly changing, and each of them treasures their precious life just as much as you do yours. Each of them lives an epic hero's journey. Thanks for choosing that. That's a good section.
Hear why Scott's voice is so perfect for audiobooks, and definitely I'm going to be doing both of them. So in thinking about this, Scott, this is actually in a section around embracing impermanence. I thought that this was a really powerful nexus of compassion and impermanence. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that combination there.
Okay, raise your hand if you've ever had this feeling. You're walking down the street and you see a stranger and you think, oh, who is that jerk? You just have an instant I have this, sorry. But maybe not anymore, maybe not as much anymore.
Raising their hands.
Okay. Okay, now raise your hand if you ever walk down the street and you see someone like, wow, I want to get to know that person, or I would like to date that person, right? We've all felt that. So, where does that come from, right? That kind of instantaneous response, I think, it really fascinates me. Buddhists would say that's an indication of your karma, like your past experience with other people from past lives. But in all of these cases, that's when it's really useful to think about the arc of a person's life. That, wow, I've been in that case. It's helped me a lot when someone's yelling me at work or some other situation. I think, wow, I think of them coming out of their mother, literally, it's very graphic. A lot of us have seen that happen, right? As the person's yelling at me, I'm looking and thinking, wow, okay, I know where you came from. And then they could die tomorrow. They could die on their way home. We all have friends who died in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, right? It could happen to anybody. So for me, it just softens anybody, even down to Vladimir Putin or something like that, where you think, okay, even that guy, he came out of his mom, and he's going to die one day. He's doing a lot of harm. But his life's impermanent, and he wants happiness, and he has his own awfully misguided way of trying to seek happiness. But he's just like all of us, trying through a deluded mind, particularly deluded one, to make himself happy.
Yeah.
So it's pretty gnarly, that last example, and I bring it, that's maybe for when you're more expert, when you're ready for it, when you're ready for that, for Vladimir Putin in your meditation, you can start with your partner you get annoyed at sometimes.
That's beautiful. So last question before we open up for Q&A,
Yeah.
Which is, writing books is really hard. There are also really joyful moments, and so I'd love to know what was the hardest and what was the most joyful part of working on this book.
Okay, let me start with the most joyful one. Most people when they write books, I've heard them say they get sick of their book. And I did not get sick of my book, and I don't want to say that for an egotistic reason, but because it was like doing a retreat. Every time I went through a revision of the book, it was like, I think my wife saw, she was like, oh, you're acting quite nice right now. So It was like doing a retreat every time I went. In fact, I even listened to the first chapter again today while I was driving. I listened to the whole first chapter driving to a dentist appointment today, and it's not just me like, oh, I wrote such a good book. It's just the material itself. It's a meditation, and it's actually quite nice to hear meditation in your own voice, even for yourself to record your own meditations. It's something my teachers recommend. It's nice actually to hear your own voice because it's like thinking. So that was probably the most joyful part, was actually that it was like a retreat every time I revised it, and I really enjoyed it. The hardest thing was showing people early revisions, because I knew that the book would be so much better if I show people the really early rough version. But it's also embarrassing. Ann and Mike, the editors in back there. No, but I just knew like I had to just throw my ego, out the door and show it to 15 people, including like great heroes of mine and ordained people, and get that feedback. So that was probably the hardest part, because I knew, and there were like 14,000 more words. There was so much that had to get cut from this book. But that was probably the hardest part, is letting out what I knew was a bad version of the book. But it was so critical. And having people come back and say, this needs some work. And it's like, I know, but thank you.
I'm smiling at a friend who's
yeah.
here. I'm working on a book as well,
Yeah.
and I sent an early version to her,
Yeah.
and she was very kind in being honest about what worked and what didn't
Yeah.
work. And it's like mortifying, and also like the book is going to be a million times better.
Yeah.
And given what you want the world to have, it's just so perfect, because it's like the practice is in the work of it, right? You
Yeah.
had to put your ego aside, which is a huge part of this path,
Yeah.
for that to happen. So thank
Yeah.
you for doing that
Yeah.
for our benefit.
And that's what, in our tradition, they say, like, the things that harm your ego are the ones you just want to welcome into your life. Like, it's actually, again, this is slightly more advanced practice, but you welcome the things where you're humbled, you make mistakes, you're shown to be wrong. Like, that's what you welcome in your life, as in Mahayana Buddhism, in this tradition of Buddhism. So, but it was a little bit hard.
Yeah.
It was a little bit hard. Yeah.
So questions, folks. Thank
Yeah.
you, Scott, so much
Yeah,
for all
thank
of
you.
that. And any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, yo.
And we can repeat them too.
Yeah. Oh, thanks Yuji for this conversation. I want to kind of go back to analytical meditation, and I have more experience with the other type you were describing, like stabilizing, whether it's the breath or consciousness itself. And I think one reason that I'm drawn to that is that, like, I feel like I spend already so much time with my mind and my thoughts and my emotions that when I see that depression, or I just kind of want to break from that. And so I get a little turned off by analytical meditation sometimes because of that. So I'm just curious if, since you both teach that, maybe you could both answer, but does that, ever come up with you with analytical meditation, and how do you, kind of work with it?
What if analytical meditation makes your mind feel kind of busy and you really like the stabilizing effect of meditation, right? Do you want to, what's your take on it?
Well, I think that it's often toggling back and forth, right? And you want to keep the experiential piece of it rich in analytical meditation. So as much of the analytical piece as is required to pop us into something that actually becomes the next stabilizing focus, right? So we go back and forth in a sense. So what does it look like to create the story that produces the compassion? And we want to leave space for then just being in that state of compassion, which feels somewhat like stabilizing meditation, right? And so that's a piece of it. And the other thing is that, the more in the feelings of it, that leads more to the experience rather than the story of it, right?
Okay.
And so letting someone else guide it so that they're giving you the story. You don't have to come up with the thoughts yourself. You're not thinking, you're feeling the story, right? I think that's a really good analytical meditation. And then from there, then you get to drop in and just really stay with that state of compassion. Stay with a feeling of expansiveness. Stay with, the what is that feeling of letting go of anger and feeling the absence of that anger and the peace that comes with that, like staying in the peace. Can actually feel quite similar to staying with your breath. It's just tastier.
Yeah.
I think is the word you used.
Yeah,
Yummier.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is that, of course, not everything is for every person, and it might be quite perfect the way you meditate for yourself, But the one thing I would say is there is an aspect to Mahayana Buddhism that's worth taking on to anyone who does like mindfulness or stabilizing meditation, is the motivation. So at the very beginning of a meditation, to think, may my meditation be of benefit to myself and others. May this meditation be a cause for my happiness, a cause for me to have better relationships with the people around me, a cause for me to help make the world a little bit better in whatever way I can. If that's the only analytical part of your meditation, like that alone is very, very beneficial. And then it's kind of like when you put a drop of food coloring into water or something, it's like it subtly colors the rest of your meditation session. So if you really only want to practice stabilizing meditation, for anyone who's more like Theravada, whatever, practitioner, to add that little bit that isn't always a part of those traditions can be very beneficial. Just a little drop of the positive motivation at the beginning.
Yeah. And also at the end too, right?
And at the end, yes,
so you could,
dedication.
we call dedication, right?
Yeah.
Is to just wrap it up with the same thing.
Yeah.
May the past, 15, 5, 3 minutes that I spent doing whatever practice it was, help me be a kinder and more beneficial person for myself and others. Like just to even, do that for a second can really, be beautiful. So thank you for that beautiful question.
Yeah. I just have like a practical question of when you first started your journey and recognizing that you want to do this, you want to be on this path. How do you actually start to make it happen?
Yeah. So this is something where science does help, because they say it takes about 6 weeks or so to establish a new habit. So it does take quite a bit of forceful effort to begin. And that's in the beginning. I talk about when to meditate and so on. My own teacher, our teachers are very, very kind and gentle and slow. My first Tibetan teacher, he said, meditate for 5 minutes a day. And I did that for 3 years. I started out at that level and it had an enormous benefit. So, and that's what our teachers say, is to create a small habit, establish it firmly. You have to think about your own life, of the things you wouldn't leave the house without doing, whether it's brushing your teeth, eating breakfast, taking a shower, whatever. But meditation can quickly become one of those things, but it's just like any habit. It really helps to meditate first thing in the morning and to not look at your phone before. The phone is like a real nightmare for attention and focus. And I speak from experience. There are days I look at my phone or iPad before I meditate. Very, very big difference in my whole day. Like to start the day and just go into your own mind. And I mean, you go to the bathroom, splash some water on your face, but then sit down and meditate. It has an enormous positive, no matter what type of meditation you're practicing. So that's what I would say, is just, try to put a little bit of force. You need some forceful discipline in the first 2 months. And those are validated if you read any kind of books about habits. This is actually the scientific proof of why meditation works, is that our mind, they used to think even 25 years ago, only kids' minds sort of adapted and we became fixed as adults. But now they know through neuroplasticity, every time you have a thought, it reinforces that pattern in your mind over and over and over again. And that's why you really want to cultivate some beneficial thoughts, because it's easy to get into the groove of, feeling critical, discouraged, lonely, afraid, and so on. So to spend a little time cultivating the positive. So anyway, those are some, especially those first two things are important.
So Buddhism offers fundamentally about about the connection to nature and the bigger natural system.
The real genius statement on this comes from Thich Nhat Hanh. This is the first book I ever read about Buddhism. My brother sent me. He said, "You are only made of non-you elements." And that has really just stuck with me ever since I read it. It's so powerful. And he is the most incredible Buddhist teacher, I have to say, of the modern era, because he didn't mention the word emptiness or interdependent. He just wrote that. You are only made of non-you elements. And I've been thinking about it ever since. And so you think about that. 2 tiny cells from our parents, right? That's the part that came from somewhere else. Then everything our mother ate and drank, everything we've eaten and drank over that time. We've each breathed in each other over the course of this talk. And we've breathed out. We have literally become each other. We will leave with a tiny part, everyone else in this room, right? That's interdependence. Many people have never thought of that before, right? So we are part of nature. We're not separate from, we don't need to reconnect with nature, right? We are part of nature. We're not separate. Also down to ideas. Every word we spoke tonight, we did not make up, right? Every single word we learned from somewhere else. Every concept we learned, everything in this book came from somewhere else. What I'm describing is a meditation. Like that is how you do an analytical meditation on what you call emptiness. The most advanced topic in Buddhism, the interdependent nature of reality. And I don't think anyone in this room could disagree with anything I just said. These are just true statements about reality that most of us just don't think about that much. And the more we think that way, the harder it will be to harm anybody, the harder it will be to feel separate, the harder it will be to ever feel lonely. Because even when you're alone, you're still part of nature. And you have every single person and thought and word that you can remember with you. That's why you feel so close to your teachers in Tibetan Buddhism. Like a lot of our teachers we meet only once, and they don't even know or remember us. But we feel really close to them because we remember them and their words, and they're alive in our mind. So this topic you could talk about for days, but that's just a little, a small bit about it. You're only made of non-you elements.
Did you find anything where you had to revise to make it?
Well, I was told to revise. My editor sent this book to the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to write a foreword, which was kind of a long shot. And 2 days before publication, we got a note back and said, "Oh, His Holiness thinks it's a very beneficial book. We want to write a foreword, and we have a few corrections." Right? And I was very happy to get a little nervous, like how long they might take to. And each one was like, "Read this book, read this 500-page book." So the funny thing is, none of them were about like the really radical things in here, like a totally psychological approach to I even talk about Seinfeld being just as good a teacher about suffering as His Holiness the Dalai Lama. They're like, no problem. Like, no problem. But it was this topic of emptiness, because it's very, very subtle. And in our school, of course, they say our school is the highest school, the way we teach about emptiness. I don't know if that's the case, but it is very subtle. And so I used a slightly lower school because they say it's more beneficial for people coming to the topic of interdependence to find something. So when you start looking for yourself, to stop and say, okay, I found myself in my atoms, or I found myself in moments of consciousness, or something like that. His Holiness's office didn't like that approach. They said, no, you need to use the highest approach. And so I'll tell you the approach right now, since you asked such a nice question. It's like the last thing in the book almost. This very subtle approach to emptiness, the ultimate interdependent nature of reality in this tradition, is that everything is infinitely subdivisible. So you keep looking for you, Christian. In atoms, there's below atoms, there's subatomic particles. Below that, there's kind of quantum fluctuations. The position of Tibetan Buddhism, it can't be proved because it's an infinite regress. It says that everything is infinitely subdivisible forever. We're never going to find a base for anything. So it's a very, very subtle view on the ultimate nature of reality. Same thing with thoughts, like moments of consciousness get smaller and smaller and smaller, and you never find like a granular moment of consciousness. It dissolves into infinity, which is almost like, if you do calculus, if you ever did calculus, it's like that, right? Like you subdivide into infinity, and then strangely, it's like the thinnest slice of, infinitely thin slice of reality connects to everything. It's how you find the area under a curve, or how fast a rocket is going, or something like that. So that was their correction. They wanted me to use the highest school of like infinitely subdivisible, which you can't prove. It's not really scientifically provable because it says things are infinitely subdivisible. You'll never find an essence for anything.
And I think that, Scott, you made some really, this was the thing about what do I leave out that isn't going to necessarily reach everyone.
Yeah.
You're talking about some of the more esoteric Bon things, deity worship, all this stuff. It's not in any way a disrespectful way in which you've set it aside.
But it really was remarkable following the sequence. I don't know if anybody else did the online class, but really pretty amazing.
Thank you. So the question is about, thank you for saying that. The question is about, how the practice deepens deepens over time. So they really say you have to keep meditating on these topics, and you don't just get it and move on. I'll tell this as more kind of a funny anecdote, actually, which is that I was in class with Geshe Dakpa, our Tibetan teacher, once. And at the beginning of most classes in Tibetan Buddhism, they would kind of go over the last things, and sometimes going over the last things takes almost the whole class. So one of the students raised their hand and said, "Oh, Geshe-la, we did this last week." And Geshe-la kind of stopped And he's like, well, I'm reviewing, and he went back, and the person raised again. And there's like, no, we did that part too. He went on to the next one. They're like, no, we did that part too. And then Geshe was almost always so kind to people. And in this case, he stopped and he said, being bored with the teachings is a sign that you have not learned them. And like that, it's just, those were the times I really learned the most from our teacher. Like there's just moments like that just totally blew my mind. So that's the thing. It really should get tastier and tastier and more. Just like anything, in anyone's field, if you're a writer, if you're in media, film, like you love going to the introductory class because you want to see how the teacher teaches it, right? And you learn something. So yeah, that's a really good question. This isn't material to just do once and you get the certificate and move on to something else in your life. So thanks for saying that. Yeah, I can sit here and sign some books if anybody wants a signature.
Yeah, there are books for sale in the back if folks want to pick some up. And thank you again so much for your wonderful. We got Samaya back there jumping, and prepared to hook you up. So thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks. That was fun.
Thanks for joining us for my conversation with Sujatha Baliga about how to train a happy mind. The book, audiobook, and ebook is available to purchase anywhere you buy books. And if you end up enjoying it, please leave a positive review at Amazon or Goodreads to help others discover it. If you'd like to deepen this conversation, please join our private meditation community and newsletter through the links on our website or follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Thanks to Annie Nguyen for production and story editing, Christian Parry for mastering, and Isabella Acebal for marketing. We wish you a wonderful day.